trying to pull up that picture for you. You have testimony that was taken on the on this photograph. You see the muffler, the jacket, the glove.
Mr. Farrell, what is this?
We live in 614.
Thank you.
I think it was January of '92. If you need to have that reviewed for you, it's in the testimony. Okay. Now, I know that you recall the glove demonstration when the defendant put the gloves on, the crime scene gloves on. Now, he mugged for you, and he tried to act like it was real difficult, it was real hard for him, and almost impossible to get it on. Well, I'm sure it wasn't as easy as usual. He didn't have to ever wear them before over latex gloves. As Mr. Ruin told you, that makes it a great deal more difficult to put gloves on. And being old gloves, the blood that soaked into them soaked in and made them that much less stretchable. Because really the issue is stretchability, not so much size. If he'd had the chance to put them on, wear them for a while, they would have stretched back out. They would have been a better fit than they were. So it might have taken a little effort and a little time, but you ultimately would have seen that, of course, they do fit. And it's no different than an experience that we all have in our lives. You have leather gloves, they get damp a little bit, you leave them to dry, you don't wear them for a while, you go back, you put them on, they're tight. They're tight. You got to drag them on, pull them on, you wear them for a little bit, they stretch back out. And that's, again, that's common sense. That's something that we've all had in our life experience. But if you're really trying, of course, you can do it. But have you ever tried to put shoes on a child that doesn't want shoes put on him? Or a jacket on a child that doesn't want the jacket to be put on? You know, you can't do it. They're going to kick, they're going to scream, they're going to avoid you, they're going to struggle, they're going to squiggle, and it's not going to happen. Now, that's the same thing we have here. He doesn't want to put those gloves. He doesn't want to show they fit. But did you see how quickly he snapped them off? If they were so hard to get on, how come they came off like that? And they did. And I'll tell you something else that really struck me. If I were asked to put on the gloves, the bloody gloves that were used to murder the father of my children, I would not be laughing. I would not be mugging. I would not be playing games. I wouldn't think it was funny at all. Is that the attitude you expect, the laughing and the mugging? Putting on the bloody gloves that were used to murder the mother of your children?
Sustain. Move on.
Okay. The point here is that the person who wore those gloves wore size extra large.
Back. Let me see counsel at the side row. Please. Why don't you go ahead and change your paper? right, Ms. Clark, you may resume.
The point here is that the person who wore those gloves wore size extra large. If they had shrunk before that night, he wouldn't have worn them. What do you do with gloves that don't fit? You throw them away, right? That's why he was able to wear them. He would have brought gloves that did fit. That's what he would have done. Now, the testimony has told us that the gloves in evidence are smaller now than when they were new. So the issue with all that has been done to them, blood-soaked, frozen, unfrozen, who knows what, the issue is how they fit at 10 p.m. just before the murders on the night of June the 12th. The issue is how stretchable they were then, before the murders, at 10 p.m. on June the 12th. And we know that those gloves fit him on the night of June the 12th because he wore them, the size extra large. The size you know fits him because he put on a new pair of extra large here in this courtroom. As Mr. Rubin said, they fit him beautifully. And he did that, of course, without the benefit of latex, and I say benefit sarcastically, latex to catch on them. So you have in these gloves all of the points that I've described and as shown on the slide. And another piece of the puzzle. Now let's move back down the walkway, the south pathway that is, that dark, narrow south pathway. And when he ran back down there, the defendant undoubtedly saw that the limousine was already there because it was pulled up facing into the driveway at the Ashford gate. It would be hard for him to miss. And he knew that he should already have been home. He was running late. And don't forget, you know, he's pretty shook up at this point. He's run into the air conditioner and banged into the wall. He's worried, got to be worried, about the fact that Cato's going to come out and worry and try to investigate the source of the noises. And he's got to get out of that south pathway because if Cato sees him back there, how's he going to explain that? How's that going to look? On the night of the murders of the wife and Ron Goldman, if Cato comes outside and sees him in that dark south pathway, what's he doing there? So he's got to get back in that house, and he's got to get back in a hurry, which is why there was no time to hide the knife behind the guest house. He had to get out of there. Which is also why there was no time to realize that he'd dropped a glove. All right, so he goes into the house, which is where at the point that Alan Park sees him go in, which is a couple minutes after the thumps are heard by Cato. The defendant went upstairs quickly. He answered the intercom when Alan buzzed him this fourth time, I think. And he needed to collect himself. He needed to buy time. He left Alan sitting and waiting at the gate while he got ready to go. But when he took off his socks, he reopened the cut on his finger. And that's why you have blood on the bathroom floor. And under pressure to get out of there, get changed, and get going, because the limo driver's downstairs waiting, he left the socks on his bedroom floor. And in that one simple, careless act, gave us the possibly single most devastating proof of guilt in the case. Because on that sock we found blood that matched Nicole Brown, blood that matched the defendant, and the blue-black cotton fiber. Now, I've already talked to you about the significance of the blue-black cotton fiber, fibers from the clothes he wore, clothes that we never found. What are the fibers that share the same microscopic characteristics as those found on the shirt of Ron Goldman, doing on his socks and on the Rockingham glove? Those are fibers picked up from the clothes he wore that night. And we never found them. He got rid of them. Now, the defendant's blood on that sock gave an RFLP match. Once again, putting him within 1 in 57 billion people. You'd have to go through 57 billion people to find blood type like the defendant's, as we found on that sock. So that's his blood on the sock. That's an identification. But that's not all. We found Nicole's blood as well. Now on this, on sock B, we have actually 2 stains for Nicole. Sock A, we have 1 stain. Now there's something interesting about these sock stains that perhaps was not made clear during the testimony. I want to bring it out now because it is very important to this notion of planting. Gary Sims testified, and when he did, he told you about the fine spatter that he found above, on sock A, that he found above the Nicole Brown stain on sock A. Little dots, I think he said there were like 10 of them above the Nicole Brown stain. And on sock B, he found little tiny spatter between the stains, 2 Nicole Brown stains on sock B. Little fine spatter, kind of like the little spatters you would get when you stepped in a puddle or a pool of blood. Mr. McDonald didn't want to talk to me about those little spatters. You know why? Because that little spatter proves to you that nothing was planted here. That blood got on his sock because he was wearing it at the crime scene when he was committing the murders, stepping in pools of blood. That's how that blood got there. And that's why you have that fine spatter. And as I've told you, now there was a smaller stain. I think there were 2 smaller stains of Nicole Brown that were only good enough for PCR testing. And there was 1 large stain that was good enough for RFLP testing. And the testimony gave us the fact that you'd have to look through 6.8 billion people to find the blood type of Nicole that was found on that sock. And of course, once again, that's identity. We have proven it's hers and only hers on this planet that was on that sock. All right. So with all of this blood evidence, what we have done, and fiber and hair, look at all we've traced, look at all we've proven. We have linked the defendant to the crime scene. We have linked the defendant to the victims. We have linked the defendant and the victims to his car. And that link has reached from Bundy into his bedroom at Rockingham. They are all interwoven by time, by space, by occurrence, by science, all linked. Now let's turn to the murders themselves. And in this section, I'd like to talk to you about the manner of killing. All right, in this section, I'm going to talk to you, I'm not going to start this way, but ultimately I'm going to talk to you about the law of homicide. What the people are required to prove in terms of proving that a murder occurred, what's a first degree and what's a second degree murder. Before I do that, I'm going to address some preliminary questions that these are not questions the law requires us to answer, frankly. These are just kind of questions that you have, the things that you might want to debate in the jury room. I'd like to give you some ideas about these questions and ponder them with you for a little bit. But let me preface my remarks by saying that this has nothing to do with the elements of the crime that we are required to prove. In terms of our requirements of proof as to who did it and what they did, this has nothing to do with those, just so you know. Because this is a matter of, as I told you in the jigsaw puzzle, this is the piece of sky. But it's interesting, and it might be something that you're interested in. So in that light, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. First of all, how could one person do this without the victims being able to scream or escape? How long did this take to accomplish? What about these murders leads us to believe that it was committed by only one person? Okay, I'll start with the last question first. First of all, if someone else was involved, that certainly does not mean that the defendant didn't do it. It just means that he didn't get anyone to help, that he got somebody else to help him. It doesn't necessarily mean he didn't do it, though. I'm not saying that he did. I'm not saying that there was a second person there. I'm just saying that that alone doesn't mean anything. But secondly, first of all, if someone else was involved on a purely basic level of observation, Look at the nature of the wounds inflicted to each victim. And I don't mean look physically because I'm not going to show them to you. But I mean, you can probably remember. The nature of these wounds, you know, as I watched the testimony, I thought, only one person could have done this because they killed the same way. The stab wounds to the back of the head, the coup de grace slash to the neck, the targeting of the neck that way. The style of killing is the same. That's just a layperson's observation, but it's kind of a practical, common sense thing. The murders look the same. You also heard a great deal of testimony concerning the murder weapon, whether it was single or double-edged, remember that? And whether all the wounds could have been inflicted by a single-edged knife. This is also information that goes to the determination as to whether or not you have one or two killers, although I must say, two killers could have two single-edged knives, because you can't tell I don't think you can, or there was no testimony indicating whether you could match a particular knife to a knife wound. Dr. Lakshmanan testified in this regard that all of the major wounds were inflicted by a single-edged knife. He indicated to you also that there were certain other wounds, lesser wounds, in which he couldn't tell whether it was made by a single or a double-edged knife. But it would seem to make sense that if all of the major wounds are made with a single-edged knife, why would you come in there then with a double-edged knife just to do the little ones? So it just kind of makes sense that a single-edged knife was used. But beyond that, scientifically, I think we had Doug Diedrich testify that he examined the damage in Ron Goldman's shirt, and he determined that, and a shirt, of course, is less elastic than, and less messy, if you will, than flesh. And he was able to see the damage in the shirt and see that it was the knife, that the cuts in the shirt were made with a single-edged, very sharp knife, which tends to support and corroborate what Dr. Lakshmanan said. So the upshot of all that testimony is that to the extent that anything can be said based on what the wounds permit in a description of the murder weapon, it would appear to be a single-edged knife. Another indication that the murders were committed by one person comes from the blood evidence. And this is one of the few areas where there was really no dispute as to the accuracy or the reliability of the result. And here's a result we haven't yet talked about. Equals 100. All right, you see that blood drop on the bottom of the boot, ladies and gentlemen? It was, that's the sole of Ron Goldman's boot. That's a photograph taken at the scene at Bundy after the coroner arrived, because you can see he's lying on that sheet. All right, now that blood drop was tested, and it was a high amount of DNA. It was a high amount of DNA because, as you can see, it was dripped on a part of the boot that doesn't look that dirty, and it obviously dried on that boot. So the DNA did not degrade as badly as it did on the concrete. Again, that's a non-absorbent surface. It's plastic, so it was preserved better. Now, what the result of that drop was a mixture of the blood of Ron and Nicole. Now, what does that blood drop mean? First of all, obviously, that blood drop, and I think Henry Lee even testified to this, was dripped on the sole, and Ron Goldman was already down when it was dripped on the sole. How could it have dripped on the sole of the boot in that manner? Well, it had to have come from the murder weapon, from a knife. Those drops are dripped on, cast-off drops from the murder weapon, from the knife. And that means that Ron had already been cut badly enough to leave a quantity of blood on that knife, and it also means that Nicole had also been cut badly enough to leave a quantity of blood on that same knife. Because unless one knife has the mixture of blood of both victims on it, how can you get one blood drop from both victims? See what I mean? The blood of Ron and Nicole mixed on the knife, it dripped onto the boot, and that's why you get a blood drop with the mixture of their blood. And that shows you one murder weapon. Now, in addition to all of that, add the fact that you have virtually no evidence of the presence of a second killer. I mean, there should be something left. But there was really virtually nothing. Now, Dr. Lee tried to tell us about a second set of shoe prints, as you recall, but I think Mr. Boziak made it very clear what that was all about. The only real shoe prints found that did not match the Bruno Mali was that one shoe print that he saw on June the 25th, after police officers had walked through the crime scene after it was broken down. You recall those photographs. 2 weeks after the crime, after cameramen had been on the walkway. I mean, what does that one shoe print mean? It means nothing, and it certainly has nothing to do with the murders. Now, what about the hair and fiber? Does that tell us anything in terms of whether or not it was one or two people that committed the murder? Now, as I've already mentioned, with respect to the hair and fiber, Mr. Diedrich testified to hairs, fragments of treated hairs that were not consistent with the defendants inside the knit cap or on the knit cap. He also testified, though, that he did not know how long those hairs had been on the knit cap, and they could be there for a very long time. But other than that, there was really no hair and fiber evidence that could be directly connected to the murders that was associated with anyone but the defendant. And by that, I mean hair or fiber on the victims or on the objects found at the crime scene that were directly and obviously involved in the murders, such as the glove, the knit cap. Dr. Lee testified to stray fibers and hairs that were in the dirt or that were on the envelope that was lying in the dirt. But stuff lying around in dirt could have been there for weeks, could have been there for months. And as I told you before, if we had found hair consistent with the defendants in the dirt there, I wouldn't be standing here and talking to you about that stuff, because so what? Show me something that is directly connected to the murders. And there was nothing. Nothing. And you know that if there was somebody else there, they had to leave something of themselves there. This was a struggle. Things happened there. Fur was flying there, as you can see. Now, while I'm talking about hair and fiber, there's one more piece of evidence that tells you that the defendant acted alone, and that is this. You recall that Mr. Diedrich testified that he found Mr. Diedrich said he found hairs consistent with Nicole Brown's on the shirt of Ron Goldman, and we know from all of the evidence that's Nicole's hair on his shirt. Think about how that happens. If the killer kills Nicole or attacks Nicole in the initial attack, and I'll get back to that later, and he touches her hair, touches her head, he gets her hairs on him, goes over to attack Ron, those hairs will be transferred. And Mr. Diedrich talked to you about how transfers occur. Logically, her hairs would get on Ron's shirt if the person who attacked Nicole then went over to Ron. There would be no reason for the transfer to Ron's shirt of Nicole's hair if two people were involved in these murders. Logically speaking, two people are involved, one takes on Ron, one takes on Nicole, but you don't have one person attacking Nicole and moving over to attack Ron if two people are there. No one wants to take their time committing murder. As a matter of common sense, you're going to get in and you're going to get out. And if you've got two people available to do it, one's going to take one and one's going to take the other. And you're not going to have that kind of movement of hair from Nicole to Ron. So it's very clear. The crime scene really makes it very clear that there is evidence of only one killer, and all of that evidence establishes that that is the defendant. Next question, how long could it have taken? On this subject, there really is some agreement. There is agreement that all of these wounds could have been inflicted very, very quickly. Even Dr. Botten didn't disagree with that. Dr. Lakshmanan said it could have been just a few minutes. Now, when you realize, you look at this crime scene, look at what you have, look at where you have it. It is apparent from the evidence at the crime scene that Ronald Goldman was taken by surprise. And I'll get to Nicole in a minute, because there's evidence with respect to her too. But first, let's take Ronald Goldman, because that's the one who struggled. You see, do we have that picture? Thank you. Okay, this is 43E, Your Honor. All right, you see the envelope, and it's just inside the gate. Now, you remember, because you were there, how small that area is, in that caged area at Bundy. It's very, very, very tight. And that envelope is virtually with one step in the gate. It's dropped. And we have blood drippings on the envelope that indicate that it was dropped and then Ron bled, dripping onto that envelope. That indicates surprise. Show you in a moment where the keys were found as well. He dropped his keys also. Now, I know a lot of suggestions were made here about how you can use keys as a weapon. I don't see how that really makes any sense, frankly. How do you use keys against a 6-inch sharp knife? And how do you see any evidence there that he even had them in his hands long enough to think about that? Those keys were dropped, and they were dropped right inside the gate. And I'll show you the photograph of where they were found. People's 56C. See the keys right by the gate? Now those are a little bit, if this is the gate right here, if you step inside, it's a little bit down to my right as I'm gesturing. But again, they're right inside the gate. They're right inside. Dropped. Ron is taken by surprise. Now, Dr. Lee tried to say that the struggle with Ron was not a short struggle. What does that mean? What does that mean? More than a minute? More than 5? The fact that Ron struggled is clear. But what is also obvious is that someone who gets stabbed and is flailing about can get blood all over the place as he's struggling to back away from his attacker. And that happens very quickly. I mean, you can imagine in your mind's eye somebody just flailing about, trying to get away from their attacker. A big person with a knife in a very, very dark area, very confined space. He hasn't very far to go, ladies and gentlemen. He's got only a few feet to move. And he's backed into a corner like that. Where's he going to go? He flails backwards, trying to avoid his attacker. A number of the contacts that you see, the bloody contacts on the fence, were made at once as he's flailing. And that's what you see on that fence. You see a young man bleeding, backing, and falling, vainly trying to get away from the defendant who has him cornered in a cage and is coming at him with a very long knife. Now I'm going to talk in a little more detail about how one person could do it. How? Dr. Lakshmana spoke of the fact that Nicole suffered only two defensive wounds. One to the back of her left hand. I think it was one to the right of her palm. She struggled very little. As Dr. Lakshmanan told you, she was rapidly, that's what he said, rapidly incapacitated. She was disabled very quickly. There were stab wounds to the back of her head that indicated movement, perhaps as she tried to run, stabbing her in the back of the head. An abrasion to the right eyebrow indicates that she was pushed or fell into a hard surface, such as the wall or the stairs. She was stabbed in the left side of the neck 4 times. There was some movement shown on her part with respect to at least one of those stab wounds in the left side of her neck, which indicates there was still some effort at resistance. And now, most importantly, Dr. Lakshmanan found evidence of a scalp and brain contusion caused by a blow to the head done by either a fist or the base of a knife. A contusion that was likely to cause unconsciousness, which in fact we know it did, because when the defendant cut Nicole's throat for the last time, there was no indication of any movement on her part. It was a clean cut. That final coup de grace had smooth margins that indicated no resistance on her part. And there's a little bit more evidence of that I'll talk about later. But what's very important about these early wounds to the head and neck is that Dr. Lakshmanan told you there was evidence of bleeding in that brain contusion that showed that she lived after the infliction of those wounds for at least a minute and maybe more. Likely in an unconscious state, certainly disabled. At least a minute, maybe more, before the final throat cut was delivered. Please cut the feed, Your Honor. Now look at the upper step, ladies and gentlemen. You can see that she bled out on that step above her for a while before she came to the final spot at the foot of the stairs. And Dr. Lakshmanan testified that Nicole was unconscious when the final throat cut was administered and she was put down at the base of those stairs. If she lived for at least a minute, if not more, after she was hit on the head and struck unconscious, before her throat was slashed for the last time, and she was up on that upper step where you see the first pool of blood, what was the defendant doing during that minute or more as she was laying unconscious or incapacitated on that upper step bleeding? What was he doing before he came back to administer the final coup de grace? With Nicole disabled, the defendant had ample opportunity to deal with an unsuspecting, unarmed Ronald Goldman who had just come to do a favor for a friend. And I remind you of the testimony of Dr. Lakshmanan in which he described the very narrow and confined space, the cage in which the defendant cornered him, a cage that left Ron nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, literally. The defendant had all the advantage, no matter what Dr. Huizinga says. He talked about Tarzan's grandfather. He's built like Tarzan. He is built powerfully. And even Dr. Huizinga said, admitted, that whatever the defendant's disabilities may be, they did not prevent him from performing the actions necessary to commit these murders. And the defendant had the advantage. He had the advantage of size. Ron Goldman was only 5'9", I think 175 pounds. Nicole Brown, 5'5", 125 pounds. The defendant, 6'2", 210 pounds. He also had the advantage of the knife. He was the only one armed in this combat. He was the only one. And he had the advantage of surprise. He knew what he was going to do, but they didn't. And don't forget, too, the adrenaline factor. That's real important. That's important. And Dr. Huizinga talked about that because adrenaline pumps you up. And even Dr. Huizinga talked about how football players get pumped up. And you know they have to. They've got to go running through these huge men. I've never seen men that size on the football field. You've got to be able to knock them down, run through them, and you've got to get pumped. You've got to have a killer instinct to do that. And that's what the defendant did. And that's what he did that night. And the defense can talk all they want about this new rare form of arthritis the defendant supposedly has that allows him to swing a golf club, lift a heavy set of golf clubs in that heavy golf bag. You'll have it back there in the jury room. You'll see what I mean. Lifted it not once but a few times that night and carry heavy suitcases. That curious form of arthritis that somehow prevents him only from doing the movements required to stab and murder these people. But that's not what Dr. Huizinga, his witness, said. He could do it. He could do it. Now let's talk about the attack of Ron. Ron was attacked with the defendant behind him. That much is clear. The wounds inflicted to the neck, those control wounds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. and some of the other stab wounds. And Ron struggles. Unlike Nicole, he's not so easily put down. He struggles, and he grabs. The defendant, who's holding him from around the neck with his left hand, and holding the knife in his right, Ron is struggling, and he's grabbing at anything he can, and he's grabbing at the hand that's holding him, and that's how the glove comes off. And by the way, that's why the right glove doesn't come off, because the right glove, the right hand, is holding the knife, holding the glove in place. But from that point forward, after the defendant first attacked him, Ron's death was not a matter of if, it was just a matter of when. And Ron was totally on the defensive from the start, trying to ward off the knife and to back away. And in the process, hitting the fence, the trees, and everything around him in a desperate effort to survive. And all of this had to have happened very quickly. And I say this as a matter of common sense. It didn't take Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown more than a few minutes to be overcome and slashed to death. And that's not really surprising. Think about it. A boxing match, each round is what, 3 minutes? And this is with men that are both prepared, ready to do battle, in good condition, who are not taken by surprise, who are prepared to do battle. And we know knockouts occur in the very first round. They certainly happen within a minute. And that's with trained professionals. Same thing with martial arts matches. Very quick. All right, next question. Why did he leave the cap and glove? This one's probably very easy. It was late. He had to catch a flight. This took longer than expected. Ron Goldman was not expected at this scene. He was not supposed to be there. But it is only because of him, because of the struggle that he put up, that we have the cap, we have the glove, and we have all this evidence. Ron's shirt, the blood. Because of the struggle with Ron, we have all of this evidence. But it's not, I'm not saying that the defendant was not aware as he was leaving the scene that he knew he had lost evidence, because he was. There was evidence given to you by Mr. Boziak, who testified that he saw hesitation shoe prints down the Bundy walk, that he saw evidence that the defendant walked down the walkway, stepped back against the north wall, and stepped out as though to look back at the crime scene. And what that shows you is evidence that he lost my cap, I've lost a glove, but he's thinking about going back but doesn't dare. Time is running out. He might be seen by someone. The longer he remains, the more likely to be detected. And probably the dog howling already. And so he has to leave. Don't forget, too, that the glove and the cap are in complete darkness underneath that plant, in that very dark area in the front of Nicole's condominium. Now, I know that I have not explained every move that was made by the defendant, which blow came first, which one came last, and which one came in the middle. The law doesn't require us to do so, and of course there's a simple reason for that. Because short of a videotape, we very rarely know exactly how any crime occurred. People who commit murder obviously try not to do that in public and where everyone can see them. Their victims can't talk, and they can't tell us what happened. We have to look to the physical evidence, and we have to use our common sense and our reason to make reasonable inferences to determine what happened to the best of our ability. And even if we had a videotape, ladies and gentlemen, it wouldn't show you everything. What happens before the tape starts? What happens after the tape ends? And what if, and of course a camera only picks up what's in its lens. So if you saw, for example, a videotape of this case that had Nicole, that was able to focus on Nicole, but not pick up Ron, and you saw the defendant killing Nicole and slashing her throat, and then he stepped out of range to attack Ron, would you thereby conclude that he didn't kill Ron? No, of course not. Of course not. So the law does not require that we prove how a murder was committed, simply because, in that case, we'd have very, very few convictions for murder. The law requires that we prove that a murder was committed, who committed it, and what degree of murder it was. So the order of wounds makes very little difference. It doesn't answer any of those questions that we're required to answer, and that's what we're here to determine, is those questions that the law asks us to prove. But there is one aspect of the nature of these murders that is a very telling point when you think about who did it. When you look at these pictures, ladies and gentlemen, you see rage, you see fury, you see overkill. This is not the mark of a professional killer. These are not efficient murders. These are murders that are really slaughters, that are personal. And in that respect, they reveal a great deal about who did them. No stranger, no Colombian drug dealer. A man who was involved with his intended victim. One who wanted to control her and failed. And in failing, found the one way to keep her under control where she could never slip out of it again. And that man is this defendant. I have one more to go, so.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid or late afternoon recess at this time. Please remember all my admonitions to you, and we'll stand in recess until 6 o'clock. All right, thank you. The Simpson matter.